Now, let's look at the economic picture. India has some of the richest and some of the poorest people living within eyesight of each other. The disparity is stark. India has become one of the most unequal countries in the world. Just 5% of Indians own about 60% of the country's wealth, according to Oxfam, and more than 40% of the wealth created from 2012 to 2021 went to 1% of the population. And only 3% of the wealth trickled down to about 50% at the bottom. The combined wealth of India's 100 richest has touched a staggering $660 billion. This is perhaps the most troubling of all paradoxes, at least to me. The surprising thing is not how violent India is, but how peaceful, given the inequalities. I mean, what's going on?
I mean, you're totally right in all the facts you've cited. I can add to those. In fact, I believe the wealth of the 4 richest Indians combined exceeds that of the majority of member states of the United Nations. Because the combined GDPs of a majority of member states of the United Nations. And of course, while we have more dollar billionaires than any country in Asia, including China and including Japan, which has been richer for longer, nonetheless, we have more people living below the poverty line than both Japan and China combined. So we've got these paradoxes. You mentioned figures for inequality. Why is it all peaceful? Well, I think partially, of course, the electoral democracy aspect does help. Because you have a periodic sort of valve to let off pressure in the pressure cooker. And that's a very useful role that democracy can always play, is that if people have reason to be unhappy and they want to seek change, they can vote for it. They don't have to pick up guns to fight for it. And that's always a worthwhile thing. But I was thinking as you were reading that Mark Twain quote, how little of those paradoxes have actually changed in 100 years.
Right.
I mean, everything you've said, I'm afraid, still remains true, and we can add to a few more. I mean, the fact that we are shooting rockets off into space while a lot of people are still trundling around in bullock carts, that we have some of the world's leading software engineers and technologists in the cutting-edge fields that Silicon Valley is famous for. And we also have farmers who are using agricultural techniques that haven't changed much in 1,000 years. With the kind of implements and animals and carts and so on that they would have used 1,000 years ago. That's still going on. So we've got all of these paradoxes that we can talk about. It's what can I say? It's a situation that is not easy always to explain. But partially we have learned, I think, over the years to live with various contradictions. In fact, I mean, it's often amusing that you know, if you walked on an Indian street, you'd think everybody's in a hurry. And yet no one ever seems to be on time, right? I mean, that's also part of the paradoxes of India, where an uncle of mine could bitterly remark, you know, in this country you can't go forward unless you're a backward. And in fact, you know, there's the opposite as well, as we've talked about in our earlier question. There is, frankly, a real challenge when it comes to the questions that you've tried to talk about. One can also talk about our society and the paradoxes. Somebody once said, and I'm sure you can bleep this out when I quote it, but India is the only country in the world where you can piss in public but can't kiss in public. And that's also part of the paradoxes of our society. And as a woman pointed out, ours is the only country where it's dangerous to talk to strangers, but okay to marry one. So when you talked about the paradoxes of India, I mean, we live with all of these contradictions, and that's just some more of them.
So is it something in our DNA that allows us to live kind of somewhat comfortably? What is it? Is it our religion? Is it like Hindus think a different way? What is it?
Yeah, but this Hindus think a different way, I think, can be taken too far. I mean, I've always been a bit skeptical about Hindu fatalism, because Hindus go to temples and pray for their kids to ace the exams and get a good job and all of those things.
And they also go to church and sometimes...
and the churches and masjids and gurudwaras and everything. Yes. What I'm saying is that people want the same things everywhere. I don't really think that we are, if you're born a Hindu, you just accept your fate. No, you work as hard as you can. We're a very competitive society, as you know, particularly when it comes to things like examinations and so on.
Right.
As I think Mr. Narayanamurthy famously pointed out in a 60 Minutes interview, Harvard has an acceptance rate of 10%. The IITs have an acceptance rate of 0.001%.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, we have an intensely competitive society. People are striving. People are working hard. I wouldn't say that you know, Hindus think that way, but we do have paradoxes. I mean, Hindus worship goddesses all over the country and yet seem to despise having daughters. There's the built-in societal preference for a son every time, and the way in which daughters are often mistreated as they're brought up, is startling in a country where the worship of the goddess in her various forms is so widespread. So that's a contradiction. Don't we see that? We don't, apparently.
Yes. Okay, moving on.
I knew I was crossing some lines somewhere.
So we look at India's foreign policy for a minute. There again, you notice the contradictions right from the early days. India was non-aligned but during the Cold War, it was able to maintain a working relationship with both the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, it's a member of the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is made up of the US, Japan, Australia, and India. It's also a member of I2U2, which is Israel, US, India, and the United Arab Emirates. Both groups are attempts to create a favorable balance of power. On the other hand, India has this old friendship with Russia and is buying oil like there's no tomorrow. So I know the foreign minister has tried to explain it as India has to look after its people, its economy, its national interests. Yet in the West, there is a lot of difficulty with that position.
Not really.
I was coming to that. We just had a G20 summit where President Biden seemed to have, and the West in general, seemed to have climbed down a bit from their position. So this brings me to, how has India managed to straddle the middle, to walk on this tightrope? Has it managed to educate the big powers on how to live with contradictions? Is it deft diplomacy? I mean, why are major powers willing to accommodate India?
Okay, well, there's a lot of things in what you've said that need to be unpacked. First, on the question of non-alignment and so on, as far back as my last years in the UN, I started talking about the world moving away from notions of non-alignment to those of multi-alignment. And I'm very pleased that though I floated that when I was a minister in the government, and it didn't quite catch on at the time, subsequently it does seem to have begun to come into vogue, and Foreign Minister Jaishankar is using that word, and the first time he did so, he attributed it to me, so I'm very happy to take credit for it. What I meant by that...
Good for him that he remembered to attribute it to
That's
you.
right, but let me explain what I meant and why I think it's exactly what's happening. We've moved away from the binary world of the Cold War era. We are in a world that is really much more like the World Wide Web, this networked world in which I'm connected to you, and then you're connected to him, but I'm not necessarily connected to him unless there's some other issues in which we need to be connected. We all have these multiple connections all over the place, and that, in a very simple way, gives us a world where multiple alignments are possible. Now, in India's case, for example, the paradoxes that Seema was hinting at include not just the one she's mentioned, but also, for example, the fact that we were a leading voice in the G77, which is sort of the global trade union of developing countries, as well as a key player in the G20, which is the management, as it were, of the world macroeconomy, that we were a loud voice in the non-aligned movement, railing against the colonial oppressors of the Western world. And now, at the same time as we were doing that, we were also a loud voice in the community of democracies, alongside the very Western countries that we were criticizing in the non-aligned movement. We've been fighting for some years now a permanent seat in the Security Council, but at the same time, we have an understandable focus on our immediate neighborhood with all the dangers and challenges that represent. So these paradoxes are widespread. And if you look at the way in which we've been trying to navigate this multi-aligned world, our foreign minister meets every year with his counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and South Africans to it, and he gets BRICS. Then he takes out the Russians and the Chinese, and he gets IPSA for South-South cooperation. And to that he adds China, but not Russia, and he gets BASIC for environmental negotiations. And these are all formulations in which India has a vital role to play, not merely because its name so conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym, a vowel, at least until today. But also because obviously India has something to contribute to each of these groups and has something to gain from each of them. So that's the kind of multi-alignment that I see taking place in the world. And in that, yes, we do live with a lot of contradictions. Now, on your specific example of Russia, Ukraine, oil, and so on, frankly, I think the West, after their initial protestations, very quickly accepted what was going on for two reasons. I mean, the assumption always was that the West was tolerating this because India was indispensable in the larger, bigger picture as a counterweight against China, but it's much more than that. There are economic reasons as well. India buys a dramatically larger quantity of Russian oil and gas, but as a result, it keeps global oil prices stable. Because if India wasn't a customer for all of this Russian oil and gas, and that was taken off the market, if sanctions were upheld everywhere, the remaining oil would have more people, including India, demanding for it, and the prices would go up. So all of us would be paying more at the pump, even in New York, if India wasn't buying Russian oil. That's one very important consideration which the West has realized. The second thing people don't realize, is that all this comes into India, is then refined and processed in India.
Right.
And you know who's been buying all the increased refined output? The US and the UK. Forget the European, the US too. So the fact is that there are contradictions also in the way in which the world has been reacting to all of this. But in many ways in diplomacy, it is considered a virtue to be acceptable to both sides of an equation. If you can talk to both people, I certainly feel that at the appropriate time, India should leverage its decent relations with both sides to try and promote peace in this conflict. At the moment, I'm not sure the situation is ripe for peace right now. But certainly, India would be in a position to make more of a difference as a peacemaker, precisely because it hasn't burnt its bridges with either side. That's the only good thing. I was a bit of a heretic in the Indian political space as the one Indian parliamentarian, in fact, the only one in the debate in Parliament on Ukraine, who criticized the government's policy, and particularly its somewhat mealy-mouthed articulation of its policy initially at the UN. The articulation has improved considerably since then. And I had justified my reasons in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine about a year ago. So there's a lot there that I don't fully subscribe to, but I've understood why a year later the policy still holds good and why it's broadly consensual within India. It just needs to be put across in a way that's perhaps less belligerent or hostile to other countries and much more willing to accommodate everyone's concerns and point of view on this.